Morning, everyone. Welcome back to Bold TV. Today's guest host is Julie Roginsky. She's back on the show again. Thank you, Julie. Julie's a Democratic Party strategist and host of the Saltier Politics podcast. Welcome back, Julie.
Hi, Carrie.
So, Bold TV is brought to you by Independent Women's Forum, a nonprofit dedicated to developing and advancing policies that aren't just well-intended, but actually enhance people's choices, freedoms, and opportunities. We got a great show for you, including a Congresswoman Judy Chu from California, and veteran journalist and author Ronald Kessler joining us. Make sure to leave your comments, questions on Facebook, Twitter. We will be reading them right to our guests. If they're smart and they're good, we will throw them to our guests, and Julie and I will talk about them also.
Got it.
Here, joining us on the top of the show is the said journalist, Ronald Kessler, author of The Trump White House, Changing the Rules of the Game. Welcome, Ron.
Hey, good to be with you.
Great to have you. And then here on set, we've also got Antoine Seawright. He's a Democratic strategist and CEO of Blueprint Strategy. Friend of Bold, back here in the studio. Welcome back, Antoine.
I'm so happy to be back.
Ron, the Trump White House is not the first time you wrote a book exploring the behind the scenes of a presidency. How was your experience writing your last book compared to the previous one, or your latest book, I should say?
Well, as we know, there's no way to compare Trump with any previous president. With the previous books, there was a formal process. Bush, for example, approved cooperation. In the case of Trump, he actually gave me the only interview says he's given for a book or will give for a book. So I did get cooperation. I've known him for 2 decades. And, I'll say right up front that I think every supporter of Trump cringes at times over some of his comments. But as my home contractor says, I don't care what he says, I care what he does. And if you look at that, you know what the results are. The unprecedented economic boom, almost totally getting rid of ISIS, the lowest black unemployment rate since 1972.
Right,
totally
but Ronald, I understand what you're saying as far as your contractor, and I know a lot of people who feel the same way, that they don't care what he says, but a lot of people do care what he says. And I would argue that's part of why the House flipped, unfortunately, in my opinion, over to the left. But don't you think some of the rhetoric, and Trump even himself on Monday, right before the election, said, maybe I should soften things a bit?
I do. I certainly agree that, there are many people, including members of my own family, who just can't stand to hear that. And I understand the concern because it does undermine our dialogue. But I just look at the bigger picture, just like President Reagan, who got rid of the Soviet Union and boosted the economy, was mocked and reviled by the media at the time. Now he's seen as one of the greatest presidents, according to Gallup. So to me, we hire presidents mainly for the results. Certainly, we would like a perfect role model as well. But I try to explain in the book what Trump is really all about. What he's doing is, even though he knows that some of these things are obnoxious, is he's empowering himself. He's the center of attention every single day, so everything he does is magnified. So when he boosts the economy, that is a psychological boost.
Ronald, but don't you think, but don't you think he inherited an amazing economy from the previous president? Don't you think that ISIS being on the run began under the previous president? And in fact, Fox News coincidentally stopped talking about ISIS every single day when President Trump got inaugurated. Don't you think a lot of these things were laid down as a predicate for him? And the fact that he's now trying to subvert the rule of law to some extent. He just fired Jeff Sessions. I mean, is that not troubling to you?
I'm glad you asked that question. But if you look at the figures, when you look at unprecedented unemployment, that means that Trump surpassed not only Obama, but all the modern presidents. If you look at the GDP under Obama, the average was the worst of any president.
He inherited that from a massive recession, Ronald. You can't say that Obama created that. That's just absurd.
Let's give Antoine.
GDP actually started to go down at the end of his presidency.
Ronald, borrowing words from my former governor and the current UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, with all due respect, you may have things a bit confused. I think the co-host is right. The president inherited a wonderful growing economy with record job growth from President Obama. And I would say he's done a good job of being a maintenance man for this economy. And while we've seen some gains, the truth of the matter is, and the numbers do not lie, men and women do, is that this economy does not work for everyone. If you look at at African Americans, males from the ages of 25 to 45, the income gap has widened. If you look at women, I think from 18 to 33, there's some real challenges there. While the economy is good for the top end, the economy has not been well for everyone under this administration. If you look at places like West Virginia, and this is what I believe part of the reason why Joe Manchin was so easily reelected the other night, the poverty rate has increased since Donald Trump has taken office, and you have to say that it's been a result of his policies, the whole top-down approach.
Well, certainly he hasn't lifted every corner of the economy, but it's certainly moving in that direction. Blacks in recent polls have doubled their support for Trump. It's now,
I need to see those polls, Ronald, because the black people I talk to
versus almost 30% now. So blacks see the results, and the results are because of what he's doing to diminish regulations.
I'm sorry, you're saying, Ronald, you're saying a third of all African Americans support Donald Trump. I'd love to see any poll that's not a Rasmussen poll that shows that. Any reputable poll.
Ronald, keep in mind, I'm black. And keep in mind, I spend a lot of time in the black community. And if you look at the record turnout we've seen among African Americans in the 2018 midterm election, that is a pure rejection of Donald Trump, his rhetoric, and his policies that was proven at the ballot box. And I can't name too many African Americans where I go and where I participate. And keep in mind, again, I'm black, where I see people doing toe touches or praising this president. And you talk about the unemployment rate being low among African Americans. Keep in mind, a lot of them have dropped out of the workforce. A lot of them have lost confidence in the workforce process. And so you can attribute that to many things.
Antoine, actually, over 700,000 black men are in the workforce now that were not in the workforce before Trump took office. So that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that the Bureau of Labor Statistics also showed that when you do an annualized median weekly wages, households have gotten $3,000 more. That's median wages. That means the 50th percentile. That means the average American annualized take-home pay is $3,000 more in Q3 of 2018 versus Q3 of 2016. That's a huge jump. $3,000 is significant.
Governing Magazine had a wonderful article just a few weeks ago, and I'm happy to tweet it at you or send it to you. They talk about African Americans and what has happened under this president and how they've gone essentially full steam backward from an economic standpoint under this president. Not to mention that when you look at what the president has done with health care in certain communities, and whether the unemployment rate is at whatever rate, if people are not healthy, it doesn't matter.
Obamacare took away my doctor. I know that for sure. But Ronald, I want to ask you something about your book to go back to it. What would you say is sort of the biggest bombshell or revelation that you wanted people to know from your book?
Well, I go into some of the negative aspects of the Trump presidency. For example, I say that Kellyanne Conway is the #1 leaker, and I present evidence to that effect. She is not happy about that, I can tell you. And that Ivanka and Jared have been behind the most disastrous decisions of the Trump presidency, namely firing Jim Comey, which led to Mueller, as well as hiring Scaramucci, which has to be the most foolish White House hire in the history of the White House. Also, I explain why Hillary Clinton could not have been indicted and resulted in a conviction, quoting the person who was in charge of those prosecutions for 25 years.
All right, well, Ron, we got to wrap right there. It sounds like your book has things that both the left and the right would find interesting tidbits. So thanks so much, Ronald Kessler, for joining us. Thank you, Antoine Seawright, for joining us here on set.
Thank you.
Great. So always very lively when Antoine's here.
Good job, Antoine. And Ron.
TV sold.
Yeah. So we got a congresswoman we're waiting to get her on Skype to turn over real fast, and it'll be interesting, I think, because if I really want to hear what she has to say about this question of impeachment, because soon-to-be Speaker Pelosi has said that impeachment is not on the table, but I'm just wondering if she's going to resist the resistors.
And soon to be, we think, Speaker Pelosi, because that's another thing we want to talk to her about, whether the Democratic caucus is going to support Nancy Pelosi in numbers that she needs to become Speaker.
Yep. No, it'll be interesting. So, yeah, I think just while we're waiting, can we play my clip from Good Morning America? When we go to the polls and we vote for conservative candidates, this will reaffirm to the national media, hey y'all, in 2016 you didn't understand us, and you didn't understand us again in 2018.
In case you haven't heard, Democratic leaders keep promising, or at least hoping, for a blue wave in 2018.
Democrats are vying for a potential blue wave in this year's midterm elections.
There's been so much projection of a blue wave, but we're not seeing the real story of how much enthusiasm there is among conservatives, and our voices are being drowned out in the national media. So yes, I want to talk about this question of blue wave with our next guest. We're excited to have Congresswoman Judy Chu. She's from California's 27th District, a Democrat. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here, Congresswoman. This was a big week for politics with the historic midterm races. What did you think of the results?
I was thrilled. It looks like we have at least 35 seats now that we've gained, and I think that more are yet to come because we have about 100,000 ballots that have not been counted in California. So I think we're going to see some solid gains over there.
Congresswoman, before we get to anything else, this was a great opportunity for, first and foremost, your leader in the House, Nancy Pelosi, who has been the speaker before, the first female speaker, is on track to be the next speaker again. But what does your caucus think about that? There are some members and incoming Congress people who have said point blank they're not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi. I know that in certain districts, for example, in neighboring New Jersey where we are, that there are people like Congresswoman-elect from the 11th District who beat Rodney Frelinghuysen, Mikey Sherrill, who said that she won't vote for Nancy Pelosi. Her next door mate, Tom Malinowski, who beat Congressman Lance, said the same. What's your sense? Is Nancy Pelosi going to make it, or is there going to be a fight for leadership?
I think Nancy Pelosi will indeed make it. She is the best person to be speaker. She has the experience. She has the knowledge. She is the one that we can say actually solidified this victory here for the Democrats in this election. And I also don't see anybody who can actually succeed in a race against her. I don't think that anybody else has the numbers, the votes, nor the experience to be able to lead the Democratic caucus forward.
So, and in terms of Nancy Pelosi, she has said that if she assumes the speakership, that impeachment would be off the table. Do you think that that's true? Do you think Democrats are going to play nice? Because I wrote a CNN op-ed about this, that if they were to proceed with impeachment, they might very well see what Republicans saw. They had significant losses in the House and Senate after they impeached President Clinton.
Well, what she is talking about is the fact that we need to have the Mueller investigation first. We need to make sure that the evidence is there for any kind of action going forward. But to do that before we have the evidence, before Mueller is able to complete the investigation, that is too premature.
Congresswoman, there are certain things the House can do that they don't need to wait for Robert Mueller on. For example, they can get the president's tax returns and make those public, or at least take a look at them to see if there's anything untoward there. The president said earlier this week that if that's what, in fact, the House does, that if they investigate him and his taxes, which is separate from Robert Mueller, that the Senate is going to investigate them, which I think Mitch McConnell might find as a surprise. But is that something that Democrats are considering? I know that Congressman Pascrell has made a big deal out of getting the president's taxes. Is that something that the Democratic majority is going to do, or are they going to focus more on legislative priorities that they've been waiting a long time to pass?
Oh, I am a very enthusiastic proponent for getting Trump's tax returns, and I happen to be a member of the Committee of Jurisdiction. The tax law says that the chair of Ways and Means can subpoena Trump's tax returns, and there are actually only two positions in Congress that allow for that, and that's the chair of Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Chair, who is Republican. Hence, we know they're not going to do it. Now we have the ability to do it. I know that Richie Neal, who is currently ranking member and will soon be chair, has said that he will first ask for Trump to voluntarily give up his tax returns, but that then he will follow up by asking for a subpoena for Trump's tax returns. And I think that it's important for us to take that step because we need to know what Trump's financial dealings are.
Well, I know many Republicans, including Mitt Romney, have said in the past that they would support or that the President Trump should release his tax reform returns to be transparent. But Congresswoman, I want to change the subject a little bit to talk about an issue that I hope we could find some bipartisan agreement on, the opioid crisis. I know that you've co-sponsored a bill on this. Tell us a bit about this bill, and do you think that this is something that we might hopefully, this is a theme we try to work on with Bold TV to bring both sides together. Tell us about that work, and do you see a bipartisan path forward?
Yes. Now, many people think of Washington, D.C. as totally polarized, but actually there are instances that never get the headlines, but where we do work together in a bipartisan manner. And the opioid crisis is one of those. We actually passed a bill, H.R. 6, and that was signed into law on October 24th. H.R. 6 included numerous provisions that were done on a bipartisan basis, and it, in fact, included 3 of my bills that were co-sponsored by Congress members on the other side of the aisle. So both Democrats and Republicans came together, and the most high-profile of the 3 provisions of mine was the sober living bill. It had come to my attention through a constituent of mine that there was his best friend that died who was living in a sober living home. And he died unnecessarily because he could have had his life saved through naloxone, which is a drug that can reverse the effects of an overdose. But this sober living home did not even have it on the premises. And as a result, this young man died a premature death. So my bill says that there needs to be best practices that are developed, and they will be developed by our federal drug agencies that will provide guidelines for sober living homes, and then it gives incentives for them to implement that.
And so that's a separate bill from the one that was passed in October?
Well, actually, what happens in Congress is that you have numerous bills out there, and they can incorporate all of them into one bill. So I was fortunate enough to have my sober living bill incorporated into the big bill that was passed and signed into law on October 24th.
Oh, excellent. That's
Congressman, I have one final question for you. We're talking about bipartisanship, and certainly the opioid crisis is one place where hopefully both sides can find accommodation. What about infrastructure? It's something the president had talked about. I don't know how many infrastructure weeks, quote unquote, we've had that seem to be taken over by some crisis that's manufactured by the White House,
or the media.
But is there something that the White House and the Democratic majority can at least come to terms on? For example, infrastructure. Is that something you support?
It is my hope that we could come together on the infrastructure bill. I think that all of us who are Congress members, who have constituents, know that there is a crying need, and so many of our districts are facing an aging infrastructure. Not only that, this could create very good new jobs that pay well, and that would be a stimulus to the economy. So it is my hope that we can indeed come together on this.
And Congresswoman, you are a leader in the Asian American caucus in the House. What has the opioid crisis, how has that impacted the Asian American community?
The opioid crisis has affected every community, young and old, and people of different ethnic backgrounds. That's why I have taken such a proactive view on this and taken these measures that were ultimately included in H.R. 6. And I do have to say that it's affected my own backyard right here in California. Actually, the drug overdose crisis is the leading cause of death for young people under 50. So we are in crisis mode, and we need to do something about it. I think that there is actually no community that's been untouched by this.
Wow. Yes, well, and certainly this is something that the president has made a priority on the campaign trail and in the White House. Have you worked with his office at all?
Well, no, not with his office. Nonetheless, of course, he did ultimately sign the bill, H.R. 6. So he was working with the Republicans, certainly, on getting this bill ultimately to its end where it could be implemented and turned into law.
Congresswoman, do you think that he will work with you on issues of commonality, like the opioid crisis, if it were passed by a Democratic House, or do you anticipate that we're going to just have rank partisanship for the next 2 years?
Well, it would certainly be my hope that he would work with us. After all, the reality now is that Democrats are in control of Congress, and it would be to his benefit to work with us on issues of common concern. I certainly hope that he doesn't hold certain of his issues like the border wall as hostage for common sense reforms that could help move this country forward. We certainly are willing to do that. We're eager to do that, in fact, and I hope that this is a time for us to come together and move America forward.
And Congresswoman, Julie had mentioned the infrastructure, and we talked about that. Infrastructure, when I hear that word, I'm concerned about the deficit. And I know that congressional Republicans passed a budget that expanded and ballooned the deficit, and I was very disappointed by that. Would House Democrats work with the Senate to work on the deficit issue?
Well, I was so disappointed that the Republicans passed the tax bill. The tax bill actually increased the deficit by $2.3 trillion, and that actually is the leading cause for the deficit. So I would hope that they would rethink that. And I know that as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, we are going to hold hearings right away on the consequences of the tax bill and how it has increased the deficit in this country. We need to think of ways to stop it, because if we have this deficit, then the ultimate inevitability is that there will be cuts to Medicare and to Medicaid. And we cannot have that, because these are the main sources of health care for millions of Americans.
Congresswoman, do you see that the Senate might actually take that up? I know that Paul Ryan, before obviously he lost the House and the Republicans lost the House, had talked about entitlement cuts. Do you see that Mitch McConnell might try to do that in the Senate? And is that something you expect to be fighting in the House in the next term?
He actually talked about doing that.
Right.
So this is a reality. This is of tremendous concern. I would be surprised if he actually did it, though, because Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid are very, very popular programs in this country, and it would be to his detriment if he did that.
Congresswoman, we have a viewer comment here that I wanted to throw up. Johnson Jaipal says, opioid issues are related in this situation to drug trafficking cartels. So you mentioned the border wall previously, and that's something that the president has very much said, that we have a lot of the opioids and drugs flowing into the country because we don't have sufficient protection at the border. In order to solve, because the opioid crisis is a priority for you, would you support a border wall or just stronger security at the southern border to stop the flow of drugs?
I definitely would support increased security measures. And I have listened to the experts who said that actually what we need is greater technology at the border. We need smart technology that can detect the drugs that come over. I do have a concern with the drug cartels being able to smuggle these drugs in, and they do it through increasingly clever ways. But there are ways to detect these drugs as they come over the border through these kinds of detectors that they have now that can see which drugs are being brought in and how they are smuggled. So I definitely think we need to have smart measures that can do that. But I think that the border wall, as envisioned by President Trump, is an incredible boondoggle that will cost anywhere between $20 billion to $40 billion.
All right, Congresswoman, we got to leave it right there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Our next guests here on set are Mike Dorley, he's the founder of U.S. Debt Forum, and Jim Agresti, he's president of Just Facts. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mike. Our deficit continues to grow with each president. How large is our national debt, and what does that mean for us?
Well, our national debt is large and getting larger. It's currently in excess of $2.6
$20.7 trillion. And it means very shaky waters ahead. So what we'd like to do, Jim and I would like to give you two a personalized gift, and it's actually what we would call your family's share of our U.S. national debt.
Is mine higher than Carrie's because I'm older than she is? Are you trying to make a point about that?
No, actually,
No, we've got the same. It looks
actually,
like.
yeah, we're not
Right.
discriminating here. So you can see here, it's a very quick table, and it shows the beginning balance at the beginning of the last fiscal year of 20.2 trillion. There was a net increase of 1.2 trillion. There was no payments made against it, including from you ladies. So the final balance is 21.5 at the end of our most recent fiscal year end. Now, your share of that is about your family share of that is about $170,000. So there's about a net $10,000 increase during last fiscal year. So I would ask you, are you concerned about that?
I am. Then this is more like a lump of coal than a gift. So you can take that and keep it. But also, our generation is going to be stuck with this. So I would argue this is the grown-ups doing, not my generation.
I would say that would be hard to argue against. And it's probably a combination of our elected politicians and our citizenship in the country that has an insatiable desire to get things, and politicians have a desire to give things.
So is there, to me, this is born of a few things. One is obviously entitlements keep growing. There's no denying that. I think Democrats like me who do deny that do it at their own peril. But it also has to do with the fact that there's fiscal policy that has contributed to this. And certainly the tax plan of last year, which has proven to be enormously unpopular across the country and across the board, is part of that. Have Republicans moved away from being the party of quote-unquote fiscal responsibility? I specifically think of Paul Ryan, who made his career on being fiscally responsible, worrying about the budget, being a deficit hawk and a debt hawk, and suddenly, lo and behold, passed what I consider to be a runaway train when it comes to debt and the deficit last year. What do you make of that?
I think Jim can handle that one.
Sure. So, like Mike said, there is an inherent desire for politicians to promise the world to voters so they'll get elected. And yes, Republicans have stepped away from fiscal discipline to a large degree. We saw that during the Bush administration. We're seeing that now to some degree. But what people don't realize oftentimes about tax cuts, quote unquote, is they're often tax evens. Because what happens is the tax code is structured for bracket creep. If you just left the law as it was, it would continually consume a greater share of the U.S. economy and a greater share of our income. So if you look at it in the long-term big picture, what you see is increased spending and about level taxes.
But have you ever seen a tax-neutral tax cut? Because I don't remember that happening under Bush. I certainly don't remember that happening in the last year. So I keep hearing this whole tax revenue and the fact that it's going to pay for itself, but it never does it?
Well, it depends. It does. It depends on the situation.
Happen?
It depends on the baseline and how you look at it. If you're measuring taxes as a percentage of the U.S. economy, you find out that they're about level. Now, these tax cuts will take some of that away, but that's actually keeping us where we were due to the structure of the tax code. But yes, sometimes they don't pay for themselves. Sometimes they do. People talk about tax cuts under Reagan ballooning the deficit. If you actually look at the tax revenues, they grew. They grew because the economy grew.
Well, we've seen 3-4% quarterly GDP growth, which when Trump was running and he said, I'm going to have 3% growth, people were laughing at him because under Obama, it was the new normal to have 1 or 2% growth. And they said 3% is not possible. And now we're seeing it. So that is, I would argue, stimulating growth, which stimulates more tax revenue. But this problem predated the tax plan. This problem of debt was well before. I mean, this was multiple presidents' problem. You mentioned Bush. What he did with the Medicare Part D, I think, significantly contributed to this issue. So what's the solution? What's the solution that you guys are advocating for?
Well, the solution is that there has to be more responsibility by our elected politicians in order to grapple with some of these big issues. And we can vote and vote and vote, but unless there's a structural change to the way that politicians are incentivized we'll never see a response to this. And yes, I agree with some of the statements that you made. It's very hard, though, to be able to look at a single president to see how much of that deficit he actually owns, because many of them contribute, are gifted some of the ills of the past, and they have to work their way through it. So you'll hear many times that Obama has the largest single deficit of close to $10 trillion. The reality was, a lot of that was given to him from prior administrations.
And obviously the economy tanking right before he took office didn't help, right?
Correct, yeah. And the stimulus and a couple of other
And I would
things.
say also Obama had some pretty good GDP numbers as compared to Trump in the last few years.
Yeah, and I think an important thing to recognize is, yes, our GDP is growing. So we've gone from the high 2s to over 4, now down to 3.5. We don't know what the fourth quarter is going to hold yet, but it's more important to look at the growth in our debt. So our debt went up 6% during our last fiscal year. So our debt is moving quicker than our GDP.
Right. Well, and part of that is the interest payments, too. Talk about that, because I've seen the charts where the interest payments are now going to eventually subsume even more than we spend on defense spending.
So right now, if we look at the interest just from last year, what it costs each household in the United States is $3,600. And to your question about how do we solve this, I think we need to make this a little more transparent. Mike once proposed, he said, you know what, instead of just putting it in with our taxes, we should be sent a separate bill for our debt and make people write the check for it. And then people would wake up. Another thing about the debt is it doesn't always manifest in a paycheck in what you pay to the government. It has effects on the economy. It depresses wages. It depresses economic growth. And that's a very complex thing to explain to the average voter. So how do you get that across and say, hey, your salary hasn't gone up in 3 years, and you're waving your fist at your boss, and a lot of times it's the government that creates the problem.
But you're absolutely right that wages have not really grown, at least for the middle and upper middle class, and certainly working class people. But explain how the debt affects that, because I think most people think that it's corporations keeping money as opposed to giving it in salary hikes. But explain how the debt affects that.
I'll try to make this real simple.
Okay.
And by the way, not what I'm telling you here is not from me. It's from the Congressional Budget Office.
Right.
It's from PhD economists. So what happens is when the government puts debt on the market, people buy that debt. The government turns around and gives that money oftentimes through entitlements to people. It's basically an incentive to sit on your butt and not work. It's saying you don't have to work. I will pay for your health care. I'll pay for this. I'll pay for that. Meanwhile, that money would have gone to businesses to invest in factories and things that increase productivity, which is what raises our standard of living. Bottom line, Janet Yellen, the number one thing that affects our standard of living is our productivity. So if that money is put as an incentive to let people loaf instead of making people more productive at work, it depresses wages.
So you're saying that people are not working because Obamacare pays for people not to work? Is that pretty much the argument?
It could be anything. It's not Obamacare, but in certain incentives, and we're at the margins here. The question is, at one time, when I was first married, my wife and I decided, should she go to work? And we looked at putting her income on top of mine. We looked at the taxes she'd have to pay. And we were like, the government's going to take half of what you're earning here because of the tax bracket we're in. It just doesn't make sense. So she decided not to work. Other people make decisions like that all the time. We always look at what's our net. And when you consider what the government's going to take or give you, that weighs into that equation. People are not dumb. They know. How many times have you heard someone say, I'd like to work, but I'd lose my disability benefits, or I'd lose this benefit, or I'd lose that benefit? I've heard it many times.
Well, I've heard people saying, I'd like to work, but I can't afford the child care. And so some people might argue that if the government helped subsidize child care, which I know you'd be very against because it obviously contributes more to the debt, it might get people back into the workforce. So there's two sides of that coin, don't you think?
There is.
And to some extent, you keep talking about debt and how debt depresses productivity. But on the other hand, you have people who legitimately wanted to find jobs over the last 8 years, couldn't do that. Meanwhile, the rich got richer, as you know, through tax cuts and through other incentives, corporate tax breaks. So it seems to me like sometimes the debt is being shouldered by the middle class, the working class, while people in the upper 0.01% or the 1% keep getting these massive, massive tax breaks, which also contributes to the debt. But they get a huge incentive to do that.
And Julie, you made a really good point here. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget just did an analysis and determined that pretty soon we'll be paying more in interest than we are for child support in the United States.
Right.
So yeah, the debt is a real problem in terms of intergenerational problems.
Well, thanks for the depressing news, but very needed.
Thank you for the wonderful props. We'll take those back.
Thanks for the holiday gifts.
Yeah, well, actually, the numbers have already been updated since we've done this, and
Excellent.
unfortunately, they've gone up
So this is
because we still haven't made any payments. Okay.
Thanks
you.
very
Thank
much.
you very much.
So joining us via Skype is our next guest, Brett Bruin. He's founder and president of Global Situation Room and a former Obama official. Welcome, Brett.
Good to be with you.
Great to have you, and welcome to Bold for the first time. And also joining us here on set as a friend of Bold, sometime guest co-host with me, John Haltewanger. He's a politics reporter for Business Insider. Welcome back, John.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, Brett. With midterms now behind us, and as we start thinking about the 2020 election, what can we do to prevent another country from hacking our elections, like, Russia maybe?
Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that the Russians have not gone away. We look at this in the context of elections, but they are here. They were here for the last couple of years trying to stoke the flames of discontent, whether it was on gun control issues, of abortion, immigration. And they are going to continue to ratchet up those efforts in the months and years to come. They've been joined by folks from Iran, from other countries, including China, but China's really playing a long game. So we've got to get serious about this. And right now, we're taking a Nerf gun to a nuclear war.
My question about this is, why do we have a president who, for some reason, avoids criticizing Russia, calling Russia out on the carpet about this hacking? And as you said, they haven't gone away. And in fact, they've probably been emboldened by that. What do you make of that?
Well, the Russians have actually aligned much of their messaging with what Trump is saying. So when he talks about fraudulent votes, you'll see the Russian news sites, the Russian affiliated bots start to advance some of those narratives, and they're helping to sow those divisions that Trump has been promoting from the White House.
So I had a friend who said that part of why the Russians were so successful in the U.S. at sowing discord through, social media, et cetera, was in some respects because our immune system was already down as a country. That, when you're run down, you're more susceptible to a cold. And that the Russians have tried to do this in other countries where they had stronger social capital. What do you think of that?
You have to understand the tactics that the Russians use. They're not trying to prove that they're right. They're not trying to create a Vladimir Putin fan club here in the U.S. They will find issues where we are most vulnerable, and they'll simply exploit them. So what we have to do are create countermeasures, defenses to protect the exploitation of some of those issues. It's also really important that we not help to amplify some of the messages or even some of the hacks that they may try to use to exploit those differences.
John.
Well, obviously, this is a very complicated subject, and I agree that it's interesting that Trump has harsh words for just about everyone except for Russia.
Well, he did expel the Russians.
It's true. There's been tough actions. There's been tough actions. I was about to say that. That was my next point, Carrie.
The Polish missile defense system.
Oh, that was my next point. You were correct.
Thank you.
His administration has taken very harsh actions against Russia. Actually, in many respects, harsher than the Obama administration. So that's something to be applauded. But I think the confusing aspect is, why don't his words match up with his actions, and does that embolden the Russians? I think that's the question we need to ask.
Well, and that's an excellent point, because it seems to me that by not making a very strong point and banging the bully pulpit about this every single day, what this is allowed to have happen is, we saw in the midterms the Russians again employing these bots, as you said, to exploit our divisions and to exploit the social discord. And again, Vladimir Putin is doing this because he felt that Hillary Clinton, under the Obama administration, did that when you had protests maybe about 8 years ago in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that he felt were fomented by the Americans, and he's kind of retaliating against that. And it seems to me that we have people in this country, Dana Rohrabacher is no longer going to be in Congress, but others, including and especially the president, who are not raising this as a red flag, despite the fact that we're basically being under assault. We're being assaulted by a hostile foreign power, and why don't we call it what it is, which is in fact a hostile foreign power?
Yeah, and if I could interject on that point, Facebook, Twitter, some of the other tech companies like Google continue to refer to this as inauthentic behavior. Inauthentic behavior is when a pizza parlor gives itself a positive Yelp review. This is something that's much more dangerous, and we have to call it what it is. It's information warfare. It is designed to damage, to if possible, some of our institutions and prominent individuals in our country. And we need to be very clear-eyed about that. If I could also say, we've done next to nothing over the last 2 years to address this threat. You will see the administration hold up examples of what they've done, $380 million out to states on election infrastructure. Here's a key point, though. Russia only needs to hack into Podunk, wherever's election machine, and then amplify the heck out of it to actually achieve its goal, which is simply to undermine the belief that the American people have that this is a credible system.
And so Brett, you were in the Obama administration, and one thing that President Trump has said was that the Russians were so successful because of the dereliction of the Obama administration. So what were you doing in 2016 to stop this?
Thanks for asking that, Carrie. Really good point. We actually stood up a robust, in fact, it was an unprecedented task force when Russia first started using these tactics in Ukraine. And we were successful at pushing them back because they tried to delegitimize the elections that Ukraine was holding in 2014. Now, I have said, I saw the example from the CNN story, that there were folks in our government that did not continue those efforts, despite insistence, I have to say, from the White House that we do so. Now, bear in mind, we were also facing the challenge of ISIS. We had a number of other hot-button issues around the world, whether it was with Iran and Cuba. That being said, we actually did manage to create something called a Global Engagement Center, which was designed to address this very issue. Unfortunately, it took the Trump administration almost 2 years to get a very small amount of money. In fact, less than half of what Congress actually appropriated was sent over there, not in time for the elections, and there was nobody in charge of running it.
John.
So to add to what he was saying, I actually spoke with a candidate in Alabama a few months ago whose website was attacked by people within Russia. We don't know if it was a Russian government. Her name is Tabitha Eisner. She ran as a Democrat. I can't remember the exact district in Alabama. But she was essentially saying that, yes, both Democrats and Republicans aren't giving enough resources to candidates in terms of teaching them how to protect their campaigns from interference, from potential foreign government interference at both the state and national level. And she really thinks that Congress needs to do more to address this, to really help campaigns protect themselves from potential interference moving forward.
You know, you raise a good point. And Brett, I want to ask you, what is the role for Facebook and Twitter and other social media? Can they be doing more? They keep saying that they really are doing everything they can, but is that right?
The first thing that I would say to Silicon Valley is you've got to get everyone around the same table. This notion that Facebook is doing their thing with a couple dozen folks, Twitter has a few people working on it, maybe Google, though I haven't heard much out of them. This has to be a unified effort because Russia, Iran, other adversaries are going to exploit those differences between companies, between countries. So we've got, as we did back in 2014, to get everyone sitting around the table, understanding both what we're seeing, how are we defending so that we aren't as vulnerable as we were. And let me just add one other point. There's a lot of commentary in the last couple of days, well, we didn't have it quite as bad as feared. Russia, Iran weren't necessarily using the 2016 tactics. And this is kind of like the movie Hunt for Red October. When you don't see them, when you're not tracking them, that's when it's most dangerous.
All right, Brad, we got to leave it right there. I want to bring you back. You mentioned China long-term game. That's a constant theme for us. And John, obviously, we'll have to have you back, too. Thanks so much for joining us both.
Thanks for having me.
Be with you.
So we're going to transition to our next guest via Skype as well. And this is something that I think, you know, to the conversation about fear,
Yep.
I think that any outsider who wants to exploit fear, that's something that we can really push back on. You know, yes, there are the tech aspects of it, but as a culture, as a society, we can dispel the fear. We can dispel the fear of anyone trying to, you know, call people names on the left and the right. You know, I get called all sorts of terrible names, like horrible names.
Join
and
the
you
crowd.
get called horrible
yeah.
names. And so it's like, doesn't matter what side you're on. It's just, we have to lower the temperature. And that's, I think, arguably is the best defense against the Russians.
But don't you feel like we have an administration that in ways is exploiting fear in a way that previous administrations never had? We went from Roosevelt saying we have nothing to fear but fear itself to a president who's basically saying we're all going to get raped and killed by a caravan that's 1,000 miles away, that's storming our borders. So, and everything is focused on fear. It's kind of predicated on making people scared.
Well, I think he represents a lot of frustration of how conservatives feel the way they had been painted as fear-mongering, racist, white supremacist Nazis. You can't have a rational conversation if your opponent thinks that you are all those things. That's painting conservatives as fearful people. So I think it was really building over 50 years of being characterized that way.
It might have, but he has he's the leader, right? He's not a cable news talk show host, no matter how much he wants to be one.
Yeah,
so I think
it happened nationwide, not just on cable. But he has said on Monday that he wants to soften his rhetoric. So
I will eat my hat if that happens.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to bring in our next segment here, welcome to the first time, Erin Velarde. She's the founder and CEO of Vote, Run, Lead, which is helping women get into office. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you for having me.
So glad to have you. And joining us via Skype is Inez Stutman. She's a senior policy analyst from Independent Women's Forum. Welcome back, Inez.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Lots of first-time victories for women in the midterm election. This has been a great time to be a woman, regardless if you're Democrat or Republican. What do you make of that, Erin?
I think it's a new era for women in American politics. We are seeing for the first time a huge surge in the number of women who are in the House. I think you're going to see a return to the civility and the bipartisanship that women bring to politics. We come to politics to get things done, no matter our political party. So I'm excited about what the women in the House are going to do and what women locally are going to do. We saw a surge of women running locally, had 82 of our 84 candidates that won one local office across the country.
Wow, that's a great statistic. That's an A. 82 of 84. Inez, what are you saying? What's your perspective on these new women, now elected officials, soon to be?
Look, I'm glad that women are running, and it turns out that when women run, they win. There's no real the differential between men and women in Congress has largely been because women haven't run at the same rates. So we're seeing that start to change now. Of course, I'm more concerned, for example, about what exactly they're going to do, what this means in terms of each of their individual political beliefs. So I'm just more concerned about what their political views are than their gender. And I think a lot of American women actually feel the same way. We have a lot of survey data that says women don't really vote on the basis of gender. But if there are women with great ideas, I'm happy to listen to them. And if there are men that have great ideas about how to make our country better, I'm happy to listen to them. And I think a lot of American women feel the same way.
I don't want to pour rain on all of our parades, but the one thing that occurred to me is that the number of women in Congress is still, it's like a third maybe, if not fewer. So to me, as much as we talk about the progress women made, it's really not much compared to the numbers of women voting and the numbers of women participating in the political process. So, Erin, to you, what is it? What is it about it? Inez made a good point. A lot of women just choose not to run. I think men wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, I'm going to be president one day. And women think, oh, well, I don't know if I'm good enough to do it or not.
Right.
What do you do in your work to try to get more women to have the attitude that they're capable of running the country just as well as men?
Sure. So we actually saw a shift in that after the 2016 election. Women were kind of losing that I'm not qualified mantra. So I do think if we haven't had enough studies on that, but I do think you'll see a shift from the feeling not confident to actually feeling more confident about government and getting involved. The role model effect of these women running will also tap into that. To see a diversity of women who look like the country actually in office will be very, very powerful. But we're teaching the hard skills about how to campaign and how to raise funds, but we're also teaching some of the soft stuff that says don't lose who you are, bring who you are to the table. And you have the skills, you have the networks, you have the talents, and we'll help you transfer the small business skills or the activist skills that you have into how to run for office.
So, and Inez, I want to ask what you guys are doing at Independent Women's Forum about Better Off Now. Tell us about this campaign.
Yeah, so this is a campaign to show exactly how much better off we are, all of us in the economy. Men, women, sort of all races, Americans together, how much better we are after the tax cuts and after the boom in the economy that we're really experiencing. So this boom has been great for all Americans, but it's been particularly great for women. So female unemployment is at the lowest rate that it has been since 1965. So women are really benefiting from this economic boom in particular, and women-owned businesses are a huge part of what's driving this economic boom.
So, and what are you seeing in terms of the candidates that you all have worked? So to Inez's point about this campaign, what are they looking to do? We have great statistics now for women with the economy. What are the priorities of these new leaders that you've been working with now that a lot of them have won?
Well, we are focusing at Vote Run Lead at local and state level. There are 519,682 offices in this country, and we very much concentrate on the 435 in Congress and the 100 senators. So they are looking at their districts. You know, their issues are local. Yes, they're running because they're motivated possibly by the way women are treated right now, the sort of stories and narratives that are coming out, the rise of being able to talk about stories of harassment. But they're really most interested in having impact on their local economies, on making sure that kids have healthy lunches at schools, making sure that there's downtown revitalization. So women at Vote Run Lead are coming to this both as sort of feminist patriots who care both about the country, about women's issues, and about making their local community better.
You know, you raise an interesting point because it seems to me like there's more opportunity for women at the federal level to move up in leadership than in some of these state houses. I mean, it seems like state houses are really old boys clubs.
Yes.
And hard to do. How many, I mean, can you off the bat just say how many approximately are even leading in a state legislature?
There is only one female Speaker of the House or state Senate leader. She's a Vote Run Lead alumni. Her name is Crisanta Duran. She's the only woman of color. She's the first Latina. But in all 50 states, she's the only woman leading a state house.
What state?
Colorado.
Go Colorado.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay,
yes.
great.
So, Inez, what are you seeing? So you're based in Washington. I know Independent Women's Forum focuses a lot on federal issues. But to Erin's point, what is IWF seeing at the state and local level?
Look, so this election has changed the landscape and the map on the local level, on the state house level. I used to work on the state level in education. So Republicans were at a historic high watermark in the states. So it's not really surprising that we would see that recede a little bit. Republicans prior to this election held 69 out of 99 state houses. It's 99, by the way, because Nebraska is unicameral.
Yeah.
So just a little tidbit there. But yes, they held 69 out of 99 houses, and so that was a historic watermark that was unlikely to sort of keep. But it's interesting to see Democrats reinvest in the state level politics that they had ignored for a long time, maybe because they had held the federal levers of power and their ideology has been bigger federal government. But now, because federal government was controlled by the Republicans and the presidency controlled by President Trump, they've actually looked at using federalism, using the power of the states in this country, which is still quite extensive. I mean, the states lead on education. They lead on most healthcare issues. They lead on a lot of things that actually touch the lives of Americans much more often than the federal government. I hope this new interest in federalism sticks beyond Republican control of the federal government. I think it would be a good thing for our politics if both parties would look more to the states to lead and not put in so many top-down, one-size-fits-all solutions from Washington. I think that would be a healthy and positive development. I'm kind of skeptical that that interest is going to continue when Democrats retake federal power to the extent that they do. But I'm hopeful.
All right. Well, we will leave that on a hopeful note. And thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Erin Velarde and Inez Stepman. I hope you both come back soon.
Thank you.
And for our final segment, we have our Bookster segment. For people who know Bold, Bookster is a website and a book community and so much more. We are going to have a Veterans Day segment, and we're going to bring them in via Skype. And once we're getting the Skype set up, but veterans have always been near and dear to our heart here at Bold. So anyone who is a regular viewer, and we hope you all are, knows that we very often bring on veterans because I think this is one of the issues that really is unifying for both parties. That, you know, you might disagree with the policy of defense or foreign policy or, you know, intervention, but at least the troops themselves and how we treat the veterans, this is uniform that we need to take care of them. And so Veterans Day is coming up, and so let's bring in our veteran via Skype. His name is Ephraim Matos. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he's author of the new book, City of Death, Humanitarian Warriors in the Battle of Mosul. Welcome, Ephraim. You there?
I am here. Thank you, Carrie.
Great.
Ephraim, after leaving the Navy SEALs in 2017, and by the way, to even be a Navy SEAL is such an accomplishment that congratulations on that.
Yes.
What led you to join the Free Burma Rangers in Mosul?
I wanted to do humanitarian work when I left the Navy. So I wanted to go to war zones and help people using my military skills in those sorts of environments. And so the Free Burma Rangers were a natural fit for me. And I heard about them from my brother who had done humanitarian work around the world. And so he told me about them, and I volunteered and I went.
You actually went back to Mosul after getting out, which is unbelievable.
Yes.
Has it changed? Has it gotten better? I remember Mosul was the topic of discussion probably during your first tour in Iraq, but it seems like, has it calmed down, or have we just stopped focusing on Iraq? Have we really abandoned any discussion of what you and your fellow comrades in arms had gone through during the last, I guess now 15 years?
Well, last year technically ISIS was defeated in Mosul, and that's where ISIS was originally started. That's where the Grand Mosque was, where the Caliphate was originally declared. So ISIS was cleared out. There are obviously major issues still going on in the city, trying to rebuild. Obviously humanitarian issues, but also governmental issues. You have to rebuild literally from the rubble. But the Iraqi people are doing it, and it's great. And as far as no longer hearing about the history of what happened there, that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to write the book City of Death. Was I was involved in a chunk of history that most people would never hear about if I didn't take the time to write this. And it was a great honor to write it. I wrote it with Scott McEwen, who wrote American Sniper with Chris Kyle, and it was an incredible experience to get to tell the story in this piece of history.
And so, Ephraim, I know we met in person earlier, and I was asking you more about, Burma and what was happening there, and the extent to which you were working with the U.S. government, because obviously there is a bigger presence, a more active presence in the Middle East with Iraq and Afghanistan. So why did you sort of fill that gap that the U.S. government isn't filling in Burma?
So specifically in Burma, I also now, just to give context, I now work with the Nazarene Fund, and I work inside Burma, and I'm the East Asia Operations Manager for the Nazarene Fund. And the reason we had to go in there and do this stuff is because for political reasons and they're legitimate reasons. You can't just necessarily get involved in the U.S. government cannot just get involved in every single war and every single thing that's going on. But the people of Burma, I specifically wanted to help. And so I'm now able to go in there and do that as part of the Nazarene Fund.
What drew you to Burma? Why Burma?
Well, so the Free Burma Rangers, right? So a lot of the guys that I worked with them in Iraq. I never worked with them in Burma. But after Iraq, some of the guys in Burma asked for help. Some of the ethnic people who were being persecuted there asked for help with rescue and relief operations. And so I volunteered to go in, and eventually I was hired by the Nazarene Fund to continue doing that mission inside Burma.
It seems to me that a lot of the people being persecuted in Burma are actually are Muslim, right? They've got a pretty aggressive oppression policy with respect to Muslims in Burma.
Well, the oppression that's going on in Burma is, unfortunately, it's very ethnic. It's very ethnically driven, but it's also, you're absolutely right, it is also religiously driven. So right now, anybody who is not ethnic Burmese and doesn't fall into sort of the Buddhist nationalist identity they're trying to drive them from the country. So last year, yes, we saw a massive push by the Burma army to attack the Rohingya, who are ethnic Bengali. Of ethnic Bengali descent, but they're also like 99% Muslim. And so yes, they were persecuted and pushed out. I think 900,000 of them was one of the highest numbers where had been pushed out of the country. Now they're also trying to do that to the other ethnic groups that are in Burma, but the other ethnic groups just have larger militias that are able to kind of defend themselves a little bit better, and they have a terrain advantage as well because they're in the mountains.
How much was that on Aung San Suu Kyi? It seems to me that she was the oppressed person. She got a Nobel Prize when she was under house arrest for so many years, and now she got into power, and you see the Rohingya and others being oppressed in turn under that leadership. So do you work with that government, or is it something that you're working around the government to try to effectuate?
We work around the government there, unfortunately, because they are the ones who are oppressing the people. And in regards to Aung San Suu Kyi, you have to understand their government is not like ours. It's not like she's the president and is the commander-in-chief of the military. The civil government and the military structure are two totally separate things. So their form of Congress, their form of political debate, and their form of political power has no say over what the military does. So obviously it's a very, very flawed constitution, and that allows these terrible things to continue. So she is a figurehead, but she does not have the power to stop them. People would like her to speak up and say something, but it's one of those deals where, okay, if she says something, she's going to be thrown into house arrest. Maybe she can at least do some good. as a politician. But I don't fully understand what she's thinking or what she's going through.
Wow,
So
that sounds like a recipe for chaos with a setup like that. But Ephraim, I just want to turn, just because it's Veterans Day coming up, what was that process like for you coming back from Mosul as a veteran, and what can Americans do to support veterans better?
Excellent question. So, first of all, I also want to clarify, it's funny and ironic that I had actually never been to Iraq during my time during active service. My time in Iraq was actually as a civilian volunteering with the Free Burma Rangers, right? So I talk about it in my book, City of Death, and the last chapter. I talk about coming home and what is it like coming home. And at the point, when I was returning home, we had seen such terrible things. In the book, I talk about a massacre that we saw. 150 bodies just piled up in the street, men, women, kids, the whole 9 yards. And how do you return home from that? And I'd also been shot. So how do you return home, and how do you just integrate back into society, especially if you don't have your comrades in arms to sort of be around? And one of the things that we learned over there was, or that I learned from the guys over there was, you can't come home with this sort of hatred for your enemy. You can't come home and get angry about what you saw and what you did or had to do over there. You had to learn how to give up the hate. And so I learned how to give up the hatred of my enemy and the hatred of the entire situation, and sort of make peace with it. And one of the things that people can do to support veterans is don't treat them like freaks when they're returning home. I get a lot of people ask me like, "Oh, you've seen crazy stuff. Do you have PTSD? Are you okay? Do you sleep okay?" And I know people mean well. It's okay to reach out and talk to a veteran if you're a close friend of theirs, but the patronizing and the trying to make them feel like a victim is not a you just thank them for their support, that you support them.
Yeah, well, we had a veteran tell us once, don't say thank you for my service, say thank you for my freedom, because that's the tangible thing that you've given to us. So I'll say, you said to say thank you for your service, so I thank you for your service, and I thank you for my freedom.
+1. Absolutely.
It was a pleasure to serve.
All right, thanks, Ephraim Matos. Make sure to check out his book, and thank you for joining us, Ephraim.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us here on Bold TV today. Thank you, Julie, for coming along.
Thank you so much for having me. What a great show.
Great questions, comments. Make sure, if you like the show, to share it with your friends. Comment, keep the conversation going. Follow us on Bold TV on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Bold TV. And for 12 o'clock, stay tuned. We've got Bold Business coming up, and then Bold Life coming up later on at 2 o'clock p.m. Pack shows for you both.
Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend.